Welcome, everyone. I'm Shari Gregory, and I am the Assistant Director and one of the Attorney Counselors at the Oregon Attorney Assistance Program. And you probably know about us, but we are free and confidential service for lawyers. There's a multiple of services that we provide, but basically we provide crisis intervention, short-term counseling, referral, and bring presentations and groups to the members of the legal community. And it is not that often that the OAP puts on a CLE where we get the general practical credits. We often get those personal management squishy credits that you can only have 6 in every reporting period. So we're very pleased with the fact that you are getting a extremely reasonably priced CLE and getting some bang for your buck today, because our speakers are very talented and they are very knowledgeable. And I want to introduce our first speaker and our keynote of today, and it's Lynn Fairweather. And some of you may know her or know of her. She is an MSW who runs a organization called Presage Counseling and Training. And what she does there, she is the principal, she advises organizations and individuals and lawyers and police officers and people all over the country about domestic violence and threat assessment. And she has a lot of expertise. She has a master's in social work. She has participated in multiple trainings, both federally, government-sponsored trainings and other private trainings on the topic of domestic violence and on the topic of threat assessment. And she brings a unique perspective because of her own history and because of the unique types of training she has. And she's going to talk with us today for 2 of the hours, and then we will have a third speaker, Robin Runstein, who is a lawyer in the community, and she practices family and criminal law, and I'll introduce her later. So without much more, I'd like to introduce Lynn. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Can everybody hear me in the back? All right. I'm from North Jersey, so usually volume is not a problem for me. Okay, so thank you, Shari, for your introduction, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I know that you're very busy people, and I really appreciate you coming out to learn more about this really important issue. I'm going to start right now by doing the introduction. As Shari said, my name is Lynn Fairweather, and I've been doing domestic violence response and prevention for 21 years. And through Presage Consulting and Training, I work with both the public and the private sector to teach them about how to assess and manage high-risk cases. I studied threat assessment and management for about 10 of those 21 years, and my work experience in police departments, courtrooms, shelters, transitional housing programs, jails, and a number of other places has given me a really broad perspective on this work. And also, most importantly to me at least, I am a survivor of domestic violence, and so this work is very meaningful to me, both professionally and personally. I'm going to give you a few caveats here about the language that I'm using today. You're going to hear me say he when we talk about the offender and she when we talk about the victim in most cases. And we know that this is not always the way it is. We know that women are abusers too, and women can even be perpetrators of intimate partner homicide. But as we'll look at later in our statistics, we'll see that this is generally an issue of violence against women. You're also probably going to hear me use the term victim and perhaps survivor interchangeably. And that matters a lot to the advocacy community because to them, the term victim can sometimes be seen as a demeaning label. But in my view, people who are going through a domestic violence situation at that moment that they call 911, that they go to the shelter, they're a victim of violence and abuse. But later, as they start to heal from that and they move on and seek safety, they become survivors. So it's just a matter of when you're speaking to somebody. Also, I work a lot in the area of intimate partner homicide, and not all victims are survivors. So I also want to let you know about what I call the toolbox caveat, which means that everything that we're going to talk about here today is part of a toolbox that you can use in cases. Not everything is going to apply to every case. Not everything's going to be practical for you to use. But just to give you a bunch of ideas that you might be able to draw upon to deal with certain situations. You are going to see some statistics and some references to studies and research in this presentation. And there was not enough room on the slides to put every citation there, but if you are interested in knowing where a statistic came from, or you want to know more about a certain piece of research, I'll be happy to tell you. You can let me know, and I'll be giving you my contact information at the end. Lastly, when it comes to questions and comments, I know that people have a lot of things that they want to ask about, and what I would suggest is to write down your question in your notes, because we may cover it as we proceed through, and if we don't cover it, then you can remember what it is you wanted to ask, and we will talk about it later. And hopefully Robin will be here shortly so that she can answer any legal questions that you might have that would be specific.
On that topic, if you do have legal specific questions, I'd really ask you to wait till Robin gets here. She should be here early, and she will be speaking for an hour, because Lynn is an MSW. She understands the raw concepts, but the specifics of the law are better answered by Robin. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Okay, so we're going to take a look at these two scenarios right here. And as you can see in one of them, a man is beating a woman in the street. And in the second photo, a woman is slapping a man across the face. Which one of these constitutes domestic violence? Both. Legally, both, right? And yeah, we don't know exactly what's happening in those scenarios, but they both constitute types of domestic violence. And we'll talk a little bit about what those types are. The first type is what people usually think of when they think of domestic violence. They think of somebody who is constantly angry and beating on a spouse and children, and somebody who is generally a violent, unpleasant person to be around. And that's referred to as intimate terrorism, or sometimes patriarchal terrorism. The creator of this typology is Dr. Michael Johnson, and some other researchers came after him and looked at what he had done and added a few of their own things to it. So that's why you see these words in parentheses down here. The generally violent, antisocial type is the type of person that would be violent toward everybody. And the dysphoric borderline type refers to somebody who has an unnatural over-attachment to their partner and over-dependence on their partner. The second type is called situational or common couple violence. Johnson called it situational, and then other researchers referred to it as common. And this defines a type of violence that occurs outside of an overarching pattern of power and control. So, for example, if there's a husband and wife who have been married for 20 years, and there is no abuse that happens from one person to another, there's no power and control and domination, but at some point during that relationship, somebody was angry with somebody else and slapped them in the face. Yes, that is domestic violence, but it is not the same type of domestic violence as the intimate terrorist form. And in fact, Michael Johnson, who created these, referred to them as apples and oranges. He said they're really that different, and so it's important to determine what kind of domestic violence we're dealing with. The third type is called mutual violent control. This is the most rare of the four types, and it refers to a situation in which a couple is both violent toward each other, and they are both engaging in power and control and domination tactics against one another. And the last one is called violent resistance, and that is basically self-defense. And that can occur either in the moment, so somebody might be being abused by their spouse and they might pick up a knife to defend themselves. That's in the moment. Or they might wait until that spouse who has terrorized them and their children for years goes to sleep and kill him in his sleep, and that's overall self-defense. So these both fall under the category of violent resistance. If you're not sure what type of domestic violence you're dealing with, you can go ahead and look for a few factors here. First of all, the mode. What exactly is the person doing to abuse the other individual? Is there violence, and what kind of violence? Obviously, some types of violence are more severe. Frequency, how often does this occur? Is it that once in the 20-year marriage, or is it every day? What's the severity? Are there injuries? Is there lasting impact on the victim? Mutuality, are both partners engaging in violence, or is it just one toward the other? And lastly, intent. So what was the intent of the violence? If somebody throws a glass at somebody else and it does not hit them, you have to ask, what was their intent? Was their intent just to throw it against the wall to make some noise, or did they actually intend to hit that person with it? So we learned about the types of domestic violence, and now I'm going to talk about the forms of domestic violence. First is physical, which I think is clear to everybody what constitutes physical violence. But we also have to keep in mind that sometimes physical violence can be non-injurious. So if somebody pushes me, it's probably not going to hurt me, but it is domestic violence. Sexual violence can include things other than just what you would normally think of, such as rape or sexual assault. Can anybody give me an example of a type of sexual abuse that is not the thing that we usually think of when we think of sexual abuse? Yeah.
Persistent request for sex.
Yes, definitely. Somebody who pressures their partner and makes them intimidated and makes them feel bad. What about things like forced prostitution or forcing somebody to engage in sexual acts that they don't want to engage in? So it's not always just cut and dry rape. There are a lot of other things that can be included in this. Emotional and verbal abuse includes criticisms, name-calling, degrading, trying to generally make somebody feel bad about themselves on a regular basis. And we'll talk a little bit about why this is different from the next type, which is psychological. Because in psychological abuse, you don't ever have to say a word. Psychological abuse can be simply glaring at your partner across a room, and they know what that glare means. Or using your fingers to make the shape of a gun or something like that. So it doesn't actually have to be verbal. Psychological also includes what we call in domestic violence crazy making. And crazy making is also called gaslighting. When somebody tries deliberately to make another person question their sanity, and abusers do this a lot. They do things like change the clocks in the house, hide the keys from the victim, turn on and off things that, electronics and appliances in the home, things like that, specifically with the intent of making the victim think that they are going crazy, because it fits really well into the abuser's pattern and what they want the victim to believe is actually happening. We also see economic abuse in a lot of situations, and this can mean somebody takes another person's paycheck, holds on to all the money and issues a small allowance, somebody who makes another person account for all of their time and expenditures. And generally, this is a powerful tool in keeping a victim in domestic violence, because if they don't have the economic resources to leave, then they're not going to get that chance. And the last one that people sometimes forget about is spiritual abuse. And when we see that, we see someone who refuses to let another person practice their religion or their spirituality as they choose, refuses to let them go to a house of worship or communicate with other people who are in that religious community. So when we look at all these things, the natural question comes out, how much is this really happening? What is going on with the numbers that we often see on domestic violence? The one that you've probably seen the most is 1 out of 4, about 25%. But what we know is that it depends on how you ask the question. So, for example, when women are asked, have you ever been physically abused by an intimate partner? 1 out of 4 will answer yes. But if you change that question a little bit and you ask, have you ever been physically or sexually abused by an intimate partner? The number goes to 1 in 3. And then if we say, have you ever been physically, sexually, or severely emotionally abused by an intimate partner? Up to 60% of women have answered yes in surveys. So we know that this is a lot more widespread than we think it is. And as we said, too, this happens to men, and it also happens to people in same-sex relationships. So every time you are with a whole group of other people like you are today, You can look around and almost guarantee that somebody in this room has been personally affected by domestic violence. Let's talk about perpetrator gender. I mentioned it before. I said that the majority of perpetrators are male. And we get our numbers through a group of sources. We can look at police reports, arrest records. We can look at self-reports, such as the conflict tactics scale. We can look at anonymous surveys from people who have been arrested or who are in batterers intervention programs. So when we look at all these numbers, we have to pull out what is systemic, persistent, injurious violence. This isn't going to include the one slap in the 20-year marriage. This is going to include something that is a part of, as I said, an overarching pattern of power and control and domination. It lasts for a very long time throughout the relationship, and there are often severe injuries that are happen as a result. And the perpetrators of that are over 90% male. Intimate partner homicide is a different number, and that's kind of interesting to me because it's 80% male. So if you're seeing that 90% of perpetrators are male, but only 80% of killers are male, what does that tell you? What's going on there? Do you think victims are killing their abuser? Yeah. And that happens a lot less these days because there are so many resources for victims of domestic violence. There are shelters and helplines and a lot of things out there that weren't there in the 60s and 70s and before. So we see that number going down for both men and women, but more so for males. Yes?
Several of the resources in our community left flyers out of
Oh, good. I'm so happy to hear that.
plus you provided a list of these.
I did, and we'll touch on that. Intimate partner murder-suicides account for about a third of all intimate partner homicides, and they are mostly perpetrated by men. It's kind of hard to find female perpetrated cases. They are out there. And also familicides in which the entire family is killed. Those cases are mostly 95% male. And we do sometimes hear, just in the news the other day, there was a story about a mother driving her minivan into the ocean with her kids in it in what looked like an attempt to kill them. But her partner was not also a target. And so that's the difference that we usually see. Mostly in familicides, the partner and the children are killed. So what you're seeing here is called the cycle of violence. And I know that these letters are probably coming out a little small here, so I'll go ahead and explain this to you. We are looking at two things here. The inside circle represents what's called the cycle of abuse. Dr. Lenore Walker first came up with this in the 70s. And it has three phases. The first is the tension building phase, in which not that the perpetrator's tension is building, but that the victim's tension is building. They sense what is about to happen, and they are walking on eggshells because they're trying not to provoke the abuser. That moves into the explosion, which is the actual event of violence. And then following that, we see what's called the false honeymoon. And this is a period in which the perpetrator is apologizing, promising that they'll change, promising they'll never do it again, maybe bringing flowers or gifts or proposing or something like that to try and get the victim back into the cycle. So that's really what the victim's experiencing. But on the outside of this circle, you can see what the perpetrator experiences. And we'll start up at the, let's start with the abuse. So that looks relatively the same. One person is a giver and one's the receiver, but it looks relatively the same until we get to the end of that, where we see the guilt and fear of reprisal phase. This is where a perpetrator is going to feel bad about what they did, but probably not because they did it, probably because they're going to get caught. They're probably concerned that maybe the neighbors heard some screaming and yelling. Maybe somebody called the police. Maybe they're going to get arrested and lose their job and have to go to jail. So what they do in order to rationalize this is they move into the bottom phase where they do one of three things. They minimize, well, yeah, I hit you, but it didn't really hurt that bad. You're okay. Or deny, I didn't hit you. You fell down the stairs. I didn't push you. Or they will blame and say, yeah, I hit you, but it's because you pushed my buttons. It's because you provoked me. So this is how they get through mentally and justify what they're doing. And this eases into a phase of normalcy, the false honeymoon, where the couple goes back to being what appears to be, for all intents and purposes on the outside, a happy couple. So you might not always know that something's happening because you'll see people in this normalcy phase. You'll see them in the false honeymoon phase, and you'll think that they're okay. And the next phase for the abuser is the fantasy and planning stage. This isn't as cut and dry as saying, driving home in your truck after work and saying, I'm going to go home and punch my wife in the face and kick her down the stairs. That's not what they're thinking. What they're thinking is, gosh, my wife's been really mouthy to me in front of my friends lately. If she makes me look stupid one more time, she's going to get it. So they're setting themselves up. They're amping themselves up. And that goes into the top piece you see here, which is called the setup. And this is when the abuser lays out invisible rules for the victim. And if the victim, when the victim inevitably goes awry of those rules, they get what the abuser has set up for them to deserve in their mind. And so this cycle just keeps going, and it goes around and around. And what we know is that it gets shorter with time. So if somebody is together with their partner for a very long time, we see these periods getting closer to one another. And sometimes the false honeymoon phase disappears altogether because the abuser doesn't see a reason to keep bringing flowers home and apologizing because he knows he's already got the victim wrapped. He lives with them. She's got 2 kids with him. So he knows that she's not going anywhere. We'll go ahead and switch to our next slide, which is really a question that comes to a lot of people's minds. In fact, this is probably the most common question that I get asked about domestic violence from people who aren't familiar with the topic. They want to know if it's so bad, then why are victims staying in that situation? Why are they returning to that situation? And I know that for people who work with victims of domestic violence, for advocates, police officers, and attorneys, it is very frustrating when you have put a lot of work into trying to help somebody and then they end up back in that situation. And it's hard to understand why they would return to a situation that they've explained as being very bad. So one of the first things is fear. And I'm going to grab a page of notes for one moment, and I'd like you to think about what people might be afraid of in domestic violence. Okay. Had to bring notes because we couldn't fit everything on the slides. So what do you think people might be afraid of when they're considering leaving a domestic violence situation?
Being alone.
Being alone. Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
Financial insecurity.
Financial. Absolutely. That's probably the number one thing that they're afraid of. That the person will come after them. That the perpetrator will retaliate. And this is based on actual truth, because perpetrators not only do this, but they also tell victims frequently, if you leave, I will track you down and kill you. Or if you leave, I'll kill your family. And so it's very easy to see, given that type of threat, why somebody would not leave a situation. They also know what their perpetrator is capable of because the person's probably assaulted them before in the past, and they understand that that person's not joking around when they say, I'm going to come after you. A lot of times, perpetrators of domestic violence have this perception of omniscience and omnipotence. I am all-powerful. The police can't stop me. Nobody can protect you. I know where you are. I know what you're doing. I will find you. And that gives victims this fear that even if they do somehow get help and get out, they'll never be able to live without looking over their shoulder every day. They may also be receiving pressure and threats from the supporters of the perpetrator. So the perpetrator's family, their in-laws, the perpetrator's friends. If the perpetrator's gang affiliated, they might be receiving threats from a number of people. They also face potential ostracization from their family and social group and from their religious or cultural groups. This is particularly a problem I have noticed with immigrant and refugee populations. If they have come here and they don't speak the language and they don't know very many people except for their small, tight-knit community, if they are told, in many cases they are, if you go to the police, if you press charges, you will not be part of this community anymore. You'll be alone. And that's a very scary thought. Also, people might experience increased risk due to an ineffective response. And what I hear victims saying is, why would I step out on a limb if he's going to get a slap on the wrist? They know that if their perpetrator is only going to get 6 months probation at the best or anything like that, that by calling the police or reaching out, they're really shooting themselves in the foot, and they know that. So unless there is a promise of a very stiff long-term penalty, they're probably not going to want to come forward. And sometimes in domestic violence and stalking cases, we see victims utilizing what we call a moving toward strategy. And that means that they believe that if they are nice to the perpetrator and if they ask him politely to leave them alone, that they will. So they may call him or go to his house or communicate with him because they're trying to get him to back off, and that's their strategy. Usually doesn't work. Okay, so we're going to move to the next reason here, which would be economic concern, and we mentioned that previously. The abuser might be the owner of the home, or he might hold the lease on the apartment. He might be responsible for all the victim's transportation, food, clothing, etc. The abuser might confiscate the victim's paychecks and not allow the victim to save up enough money. A perpetrator may engage in professional or educational sabotage to keep a victim from being able to support themselves. And they do things like I mentioned before. If you're turning off the clocks and hiding the keys, it's going to be kind of hard to get to work in the morning for the victim. And so they purposely will do things to get victims fired. They'll call the workplace 40 times a day. They will show up and create problems with customers. They'll do things that are designed to get the victim fired. And we cannot forget when we're working with these cases that there's an emotional component here. This could be a situation where they still love the abuser. They feel pity on the abuser. They feel like it's their responsibility to help that person. They feel a sense of obligation. I took vows. I got married. I have to stick this out. They may feel guilt because they may believe that they do have a role in the violence that happens, and the abuser will definitely back that up and tell them they do. They might just be hoping that if they stick this out, the abuser will change. And that's something else the abuser backs up by saying during the honeymoon period, I'm sorry, this will never happen again. I just need to get counseling. I just need alcohol treatment, whatever it is. Often in domestic violence situations that go on over a long period of time, we see traumatic bonding. And that is best likened to Stockholm Syndrome. I'm sure you all remember the case in Sweden in the 70s where a bank robber held people hostage, and afterward his victims were supportive of him and wanted to help him out. And people couldn't understand what that was about. But they realized that in these cases, victims of domestic violence are very much like people who are being held hostage. So they're experiencing small acts of kindness from the perpetrator. They're being told, and they feel that there is no potential escape from their situation. And they get this idea of learned helplessness. I can't get out of this. I'm never going to get out of this. This is just the way it is. They also suffer from broken self-esteem after many years of being degraded and insulted and criticized. And many of them feel, somebody over here said that people don't want to be alone. And many people feel that the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. And so they're reluctant to go out there into the world because at least in their situation, they know what's going on. They might be afraid they can't support themselves and their kids on their own. And children, in fact, would be another section on their own because children will often side with the abusive parent. They still will say they love that parent and they want that parent to be part of their life. An incarcerated abuser cannot pay child support or help out with the kids, so the mom might feel she can't handle it on her own. And victims often believe that Child Protective Services, as somebody mentioned, will remove their kids, and in some cases they're right. If Child Protective Services finds that there's been a failure to protect, they might actually remove the kids from the home. And if somebody's already involved with child services,